Welcome to Verdant Files. This is part 1 of Cheat Code, What If Deku Was a Hacker? Sit back and enjoy. Chapter 1, The Death of a Dream. Izuku numbly watched the door shut behind All Might. Kaken had been right, he really couldn't be a hero. Izuku felt the tears prickling at the corners of his eyes and looked around. If he went home right now, Mom would hear him crying in his room and wonder what was wrong, and Izuku didn't really feel up to explaining himself right then. This rooftop, however, was completely deserted. Making his decision, he sat down and hugged his knees to his chest as he let himself break down. He should have known that would be All Might's answer. He had studied quirks for years, so he of all people should know that a quirkless teenager had no chance of beating villains with strong quirks. He couldn't even beat Kaken. He should have seen this coming. So why did it still hurt so much? After a few minutes of this, he became vaguely aware of the sounds of fireworks in the distance and almost stood up to look before changing his mind and curling up even tighter as he sobbed harder. The fireworks would probably look pretty and might even cheer him up a little bit, but Izuku wasn't really in the mood for pretty things. No matter how cool they looked, fireworks wouldn't be able to put his shattered dream back together. The explosions were a good background for his pity party, though, Izuku thought with a wet chuckle. It was almost like the world itself was celebrating that he'd finally come to terms with reality. He couldn't really tell if he was sobbing or laughing at the mental image of Kaken and his teachers in party hats, gathering around a cake with All Might's true form on it as they set off confetti poppers. Congratulations! Disgruntled expression on his face at being forced into a party hat, but Annie Mistuki would probably just hit him on the head if he tried to take it off. Mom would be the one to cut the cake, and she'd look proud and relieved as she gave him the first piece and told him to be sure to pick something safe for his next dream. Izuku took a deep breath and stood up, wiping the last of his tears from his cheeks. There was still a dull ache in his chest, and he still didn't know what he was supposed to do now, but, well, it probably wasn't the best coping mechanism, but he felt like his imaginary pity party was almost like a funeral for his aspirations of being a hero. Wait, was this feeling grief? That would make sense, but it seemed weird to feel grief for something that wasn't a person. His dream was kind of like a pet, right? He'd cared for it for years and refused to let go, and now it was gone, so it was probably okay to be a little sad. The sun had set sometime during his breakdown, so Izuku hurried straight home, only pausing once to check his reflection in a shop window to make sure his eyes weren't too red. He ran up the stairs to his apartment and quickly took off his shoes before digging in his backpack for his hero analysis notebook. Between the sludge villain and the koi pond, he was lucky that it was legible at all. He should put it in the freezer to save it, so he could transfer his notes into another book. Then he could carefully take out the pages that All Might had signed and frame them. "I'm home," he called out as he walked toward the kitchen. He should put the notebook in a plastic bag before putting it in the freezer, so it didn't get anything gross on the food. His thoughts were interrupted by his mom running at him so fast that she slid across the kitchen floor and almost knocked him down with the force of her hug. "Oh, Izuku, I was so worried about you." Izuku looked at the clock. He wasn't that much later than he normally was. He knew for a fact he'd gotten home much later because he'd lost track of time watching hero fights. So why was Mom so worried today? She couldn't know what All Might had told him yet. Could she? Mom was still talking, rambling in her worry. "I saw about Katsuki on the news, and I know that you take that route home sometimes, and I couldn't see you, and you weren't answering your phone, and I was just imagining what would have happened if the villain had grabbed you instead, because Katsuki was barely fighting him off with his explosions, and..." Izuku went cold. What? What happened to Kaken? Mom froze. "Why, you didn't know?" Izuku shook his head frantically and stared at her with wide eyes. Mom pressed her lips together in worry, then led him into the living room and unmuted the TV. There was a young reporter on the screen, backlit against a few still-burning fires as backdraft, and a few other heroes lingered in the background. The sludge villain seemed to be intent on suffocating his victim. Thankfully, the heroes on the scene were able to keep the others in the area safe until the arrival of All Might, who defeated the villain and saved the hostage, as expected of the #1 hero. The sludge villain has now been taken into custody by police, while the hostage and several bystanders were taken to the hospital for various injuries. They had to take him to the hospital? Izuku fretted. Is he going to be okay? Thankfully, Mom nodded quickly. Miss Stuckey said he won't even have to stay the night. The only reason they took him at all was because he apparently passed out for a minute or two before All Might got to him, but he's going to be okay. Izuku sighed in relief. He wasn't sure what he'd do if Kakin had been hurt or died. It would have been his fault for distracting All Might and making him use up all his time, and Izuku wasn't sure if he'd be able to deal with that, especially since the description of the villain sounded like the one All Might had saved Izuku from, which meant that Izuku distracting him probably allowed the villain to escape. It was a good thing he'd already held the funeral for his dream, because there was no way he was capable of being a hero if he let villains escape like that. But Kakin was okay. All Might saved him. Oh no, was All Might okay? Izuku quickly excused himself and ran to his computer to look up footage of the fight. All Might didn't look tired, but then again, he didn't look like a skeleton either, so Izuku knew he was good at hiding things. He almost melted in relief when All Might jumped away without talking to a single reporter as soon as Kakin was safe. He was already past his limit when he talked to Izuku, and he'd probably had to go beyond that to save Kakin, but that didn't mean he had to force himself to stay and chat. Hopefully he was at home, taking a well-deserved nap. Izuku spent the rest of the night studying the fight. The sludge villain was a lot less impressive when he wasn't drowning in it, but apparently the heroes on the scene before All Might got there didn't agree, because they seemed at a loss for what to do. Izuku pulled out a new notebook and started analyzing. While it made sense for Backdraft to fight the fires, it would have been better to prioritize the rescue and have him dilute the villain enough for him to let go of Kakin. It would have meant leaving the fires burning, but since there were more fires the longer Kakin was held hostage, it would have been better in the long run. MT Lady could have helped with evacuation, especially if Backdraft was busy taking care of the villain. Her height prevented her from getting into the narrow street where the fight was, but it was wide enough that she could have reached her arm in and let people climb onto it from the upper windows. And if she could reach her arm in, it might even have been possible for her to grab Kakin from the villain without ever stepping into the street, depending on how far down the street they were. Kamui Woods and Death Arms were more difficult, but if Kamui had looped around to come at the villain from behind, he might have been able to grab Kakin without getting in range of his hands. Death Arms could easily have helped with evacuation. Eventually, Mom confiscated his notebook and forced him to go to bed, but Izuku's head still kept him awake for another hour, going through all the possibilities of how that fight could have gone differently. Finally, his thoughts slowed down enough for him to slowly drift off to sleep with one last coherent thought. Is there a way to help heroes? Chapter 2, A New Dream. All right, students, remember that your finalized high school application plans need to be turned into the guidance counselor by the end of the week. The teacher said boredly. So if you want to make any changes, they need to be done by then. The bell rang, and Izuku hurried to put the rest of his books and get out of the room before Kakin could corner him. Things had been kind of weird since the sludge villain incident a few days ago, and it seemed like Kakin was constantly 2 seconds away from exploding, even more so than he usually was at least. It probably had something to do with the fact that he had to be saved, and he was probably thinking that their classmates were looking down on him for being weak. So Izuku just thought it would be smarter to avoid him until things calmed down a little bit. Unfortunately, Kakin had other plans. Izuku had barely managed to get out the front gates of the school when he found himself being slammed into the wall. He coughed as he struggled to catch his breath again, clutching his backpack to his chest so Kakin couldn't steal it. He had just finished transferring all his hero analysis notes into a fresh notebook. He couldn't let it get destroyed again. You heard what Teach said. Kakin scowled as he held Izuku against the wall. It's your last chance to change your fucking mind about going to UA? You damn nerd. You'd better take it, because there's no chance a worthless nobody like you is ever going to be a hero. I know, Izuku muttered. Kakin froze. What did you just say? Izuku took a deep breath. I said I know, Kakin. I can't even defend myself from villains. How could I ever hope to defend other people? You were right. I'm never going to be a hero. Izuku took advantage of the short moment Kakin stood there gaping like a fish to pull out of his grip and run down the street, blinking away his tears. It was one thing admitting the truth to himself, but it was another thing entirely to say it to Kakin like that. It made it more real, somehow, And even though the pain was a lot less than it had been when All Might first gave him a reality check, it still hurt. And now everyone would know. It wouldn't take long for Kakin to rant about it to his lackeys, and from there it would spread like wildfire, and soon enough, the entire school would know that Izuku Midoriya had finally given up on his dream of being a hero. It would be too late to change his mind. But then again, wasn't it too late already? It had been too late ever since he turned 4. He was running out of time to find his new dream. Their high school plans were due in just a few days, but Izuku didn't know what he was supposed to write. He'd always wanted to go to UA because it was the best heroic school in Japan, but now he knew that he couldn't be a hero. It put everything into question. Maybe he should go to a different high school, since he didn't need to go to a school with a hero course anymore. But he still thought it would be cool to go to UA. It was where All Might had gone. He could just go into general studies, or maybe one of the other courses would be better. Izuku ran a hand through his curls, wincing as his fingers caught in the tangles, and sighed. He needed to do a little more research before he made a decision. He sat down at his computer as soon as he got home and pulled up UA's website, navigating to the application page. He'd never actually read through the information about all the different courses since he'd been too fixated on the hero course, but better late than never, right? Thankfully, there was a page on UA's explaining each of the different courses and how to apply. Izuku started off by reading about general studies, obviously, since that was most likely where he'd end up. It seemed pretty standard, honestly. They would teach him the basic subjects, but Izuku didn't know how to feel about the fact that it didn't have any particular focus. General studies would look good on his resume, but that seemed to be all it would do for him. He didn't want to get bored. Izuku bit his lip and clicked on the business course. There seemed to be a lot of money management involved in that one, which didn't really appeal to him. The heroic analytics classes sounded slightly better, but they mostly approached things from a marketing standpoint, rather than focusing on quirks like Izuku did. He decided to put a pin in that one. If he didn't find anything better, business might be a decent option, but it wasn't going to be his first choice. He almost just closed his browser instead of reading the page on the support course. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't have any experience in mechanics or fixing things, and while he found the way support items interacted with quirks interesting, he wasn't really interested in making them. But he'd looked through all the other courses, so he may as well glance at support, if only to complete the set. At first, the support course looked exactly like what Izuku expected. There were pictures of students standing with their inventions and groups of kids with grease-covered cheeks smiling at the camera, a wide variety of power tools, and other things he couldn't name in the background. Try as he might, Izuku just couldn't see himself there, but then he noticed the different tracks. The business course obviously had different areas of emphasis, like marketing or economics, but Izuku had just assumed that support was like heroics or general studies, where all the students were grouped together and had similar goals. But about halfway down the support course information page, there was an explanation of different tracks within the support course. The first was invention, which the website said was obviously the most popular option. It focused on being able to create and maintain support items, specifically for heroes. Izuku had just kind of assumed that was what the entire support course did. What else could there be? Support items for civilians? But UA was a hero school. He scrolled past the invention track down to the next option, design. It focused entirely on the aesthetics of hero costumes, something that Izuku hadn't even thought about as being part of support. It was a decently popular emphasis, and the students worked frequently with the business school to make sure they were designing looks that could sell, and with the invention track to make sure any support items visually matched the rest of the hero's costume. Izuku didn't think he was really artistic enough to enjoy that, though. That brought him to the final track, which almost seemed like it had been added to the list as an afterthought. Intelligence and analytics. Unlike the other two tracks, there weren't any pictures advertising that emphasis, and it didn't seem like it was chosen very often, but as he read the short paragraph, Izuku gradually became so excited he could hardly breathe. Students in the Intelligence and Analytics track of UA's support course focus on quirk analysis and helping heroes improve their quirk control and skill. Students are trained in how to obtain useful information to help heroes and detectives track down and defeat villains, as well as how to use quirk analysis to pinpoint villains' weaknesses. Interested students also have the option of taking courses in strategy if desired. Izuku couldn't help but think of the heroes that stood on the sidelines and waited for All Might while Kakin was being attacked by the sludge villain. If he joined the support course, he could share his strategies with them. He could help the heroes strategize better and use their quirks more intelligently to take down villains and protect people. It was too dangerous for a quirkless kid like him to be on the front lines, but that didn't mean he couldn't work behind the scenes to make sure the heroes had all the tools and information they needed so that they knew what to do. He could help the heroes work smarter. It was perfect. Izuku glanced over at his collection of hero analysis for the future. All these years, he'd assumed that the future he was preparing for was his career as a hero. But maybe this whole time, he'd really been preparing for a career in hero support. His cheeks were starting to hurt from how widely he was smiling, and he was vaguely aware of the fact that he was mumbling as his brain spun with plans and possibilities. He would have to work hard for the next 10 months if he had any chance of passing the entrance exam, but rather than being intimidated by the challenge, Izuku just felt invigorated. He grabbed a brand new notebook from his desk and wrote support course preparation on the cover. Izuku Midoriya had found a new dream, and this time it was attainable. Chapter 3: Preparation. The final 10 months before the entrance exam flew by almost too quickly. One of the first things Izuku had done after finding his new dream was research everything he could find about analytics and intelligence gathering. He couldn't find that much, which he supposed shouldn't be very surprising, considering that he hadn't even known it was a career option, but the things that he could find emphasized computer skills and making sure that his analysis was understandable to other people. Izuku had worked nonstop to make sure he was ready for the entrance exam today. It was difficult, since UA's website didn't say what exactly he'd be asked to do, but he wasn't about to let that stop him. He threw himself into support with a passion, spending hours researching everything that heroes needed to know going into a situation and thinking about what he could do from behind the scenes to make them more effective. His hero analysis notebooks had improved as well. He still labeled them for the future, but he was now trying to focus on suggestions for improvement and on increasing the speed of his analysis. Izuku had shifted the focus of the notebooks from just heroes to everything to do with quirks and even battle strategy. He filled an entire notebook just with analyses of villains he'd seen on the news, and another with random quirks that he found on the street. He'd also stopped taking them out at school, so that his bullies wouldn't be tempted to destroy these ones like they had all the others. School had surprisingly gotten a lot better for Izuku over the past few months. His bullies hadn't stopped after the word spread that he wasn't trying for the hero course anymore, but now everyone was at a loss for how to actually hurt him. He hadn't told anyone at school about the support course, since the high school application plans simply listed the school, not the emphasis. The teachers assumed he'd switched his goal to general studies, and from what Izuku could gather, the other students thought he was going for the nearest high school with a high acceptance rate. As a result, no one could target his new dream, and all their insults fell flat. Even Kakin had switched to mostly ignoring him, or just calling him useless, which was a huge improvement. One of the best things that had come from his new dream, though, was actually his relationship with his mother. He hadn't realized just how much his old dream had come between them, but now that it was no longer in the way, they'd grown so much closer. Her worry seemed less like she was trying to suffocate him, and more like it was just how she showed that she cared. When he'd sat her down to talk about his new dream, she had immediately started crying. Izuku had understandably started panicking, wondering what he had said wrong. But as soon as she had calmed down enough to be coherent, Mom had assured him that she was just so happy and proud of him. He hadn't been quite sure how to feel about the fact that her first reaction to him giving up on his lifelong dream was to be so happy that she cried, but there wasn't much he could do about it. Maybe if she had just believed in him earlier. Izuku shook his head as he finished getting ready to leave. It wouldn't do any good to worry about what-ifs right now. Mom was just trying to keep him safe, so it made perfect sense that she would be happy that he'd picked a safer option. She had been a little nervous about him still working in the heroics industry, but after he'd assured her that he wouldn't actually be fighting anyone, she'd calmed down and had actually been surprisingly supportive. He carefully placed his laptop in his bag and smiled. Mom had gotten it for him as a celebration gift after he'd explained what intelligence and analytics was, and it had actually been her idea to sign him up for computer programming lessons at their local community center. He'd taken to them like a duck to water, and it hadn't been long at all before he'd started learning to hack. Mom didn't necessarily like when he called it hacking, since she thought that sounded dangerous or like something a villain would do, but Izuku had pointed out that it would be a really useful way to gather information. He'd be protected behind a screen, and the only people he'd be hacking were villains, to make sure they couldn't hide anything from the heroes. She'd come around pretty quickly after that. The last thing he packed was the portfolio he'd created to demonstrate his quirk analysis. UA's website had said that in addition to the same written exam that all the other courses took, the support course exam consisted of a portfolio and a practical. Izuku had spent months debating what to put in his portfolio before Mom had suggested simply turning in one of his hero analysis notebooks. He didn't feel like those were quite good enough to turn into UA, though, so he decided to turn in a new analysis notebook that was actually properly formatted. He'd picked 5 heroes and 5 villains to highlight, since the website had said he'd be analyzing both as part of UA, and he'd had Mom read through all of them to make sure they didn't just sound like his normal muttering. When he'd first started asking her to read his analyses to make sure other people could understand them, she pointed out that he wrote almost completely in run-on sentences and sometimes dropped words completely because his brain was moving faster than his hands could. He'd focused since then on editing his analyses into a coherent whole and making them easy to understand. The heroes he would eventually be working with needed to be able to read, though, and find what they needed, after all, so there needed to be some sort of formatting, and he couldn't use a lot of technical jargon, not that he ever really had. He'd experimented quite a bit, and had even looked up how professional analysts formatted their essays for inspiration. Overall, Izuku was actually extremely proud of how professional his portfolio looked once he was finished, and Mom hadn't had any trouble understanding it, so that was a huge plus. Mom scooped him into a hug almost as soon as he made it to the kitchen. "Oh, baby, do you have everything? Do you have your laptop? Will you even need your laptop? It's best to just bring it, right? Even if you don't need it? Or will that be weird? They won't see it as cheating, will they? Oh, if only." "Mom, take a deep breath." He pulled away from her and smiled. "I'll be fine. I already checked the website, and support course applicants are allowed to bring any technology they think they'll need. I don't know if I'll need my laptop, but I want to be able to demonstrate my hacking if they ask me to." Mom sighed in relief. "Oh, that's good. I'm just so worried. I know you'll be fine and safe, but a mother worries, you know?" Izuku laughed. "I know. Don't worry. The support course exam isn't like the hero course one, so I'm not going to get hurt. Just be glad you're not Andy Mitsuki today. No matter what the hero course practical is, there's bound to be some aspect of combat included." Mom wrung her hands nervously. "Oh, I don't think I'd be able to handle it. I know Katsuki can handle himself in a fight, but I'm just so glad you're not trying for the hero course. I'm not sure I'd even be able to let you leave the house without having a heart attack." Izuku smiled sadly. His grief had long since faded to a dull ache, and he hardly even noticed it anymore most days, but his nervousness about the entrance exam was bringing everything to the surface again. What if he'd made the wrong choice? What if he was meant to be a hero? What if he'd never really be satisfied with the support course? What if Kaken was right, and he really was useless, and he failed the entrance exam, and ended up living under a bridge? And, "Stop that, Izuku." Mom hit him gently on the arm, and smiled to pull him from his spiral. "I'm the one who's supposed to be worrying, so just leave that to me, and you focus on doing your best." "Okay, baby." Izuku smiled and nodded in determination. "Thanks, Mom. I should get going. Wish me luck." "Good luck." Mom started sniffling as he put on his shoes, then started full-on crying as he waved to her when he got down to the street. Izuku gripped the straps of his backpack and took a deep breath as he headed toward the train station. He could do this. That concludes part 1. The story will continue in the next video. Stick around.